Okay, welcome back. We're going to dig into the European invasion here, and this lecture is going to be particularly focusing on the English invasion. And so, uh, if you have been reading Ned Blackhawk's book, one of the things that I like about Blackhawk's book is that he gives us a nice account of the longer history of the Spanish occupation in North and South America, which is going on for a century more, and also French as well, right? So you want to be contrasting those the things that Black Hawk is saying about the Spanish situation with the New England one. And so, but this so many Americans, like U.S. citizens currently today, still encounter U.S. history in terms of like an East to West phenomenon, beginning with like the Puritans and their seeking of religious tolerance and all of that sort of stuff. And so this lecture is really about shifting the ways that we might think about what's really going on with that narrative and looking particularly at the legal phenomena that are justifying, in the Euro-Christians' minds, the ways that they are treating Native peoples. So I'm going to share my screen here and get the PowerPoint going. And then I'm going to do the slideshow and share. Here we go. I call it East Coast invasion rhetoric because when we're thinking about rhetoric, we're thinking about like that Euro-Christian worldview and the things that they are doing publicly in legal discourse and fiction writing, in the ways that they're writing letters back to people in England or Europe more broadly, that are framing the justification for not only their existence, but what they're doing to and in relation to Native peoples. So um, we want to think quickly about this Central American precedent. Earlier um, on, I mentioned Bartolome de las Casas. After accounting for his estimate of 12 million native deaths in the Caribbean, Las Casas in 1542 recounted the quote discovery of New Spain, noting so-called conquest, right? Now we know, and this is a good thing that Duval's book covers, I think, and I think Black Hawk's book covers it as well. Uh, Really, it's like Hernan Cortez and folks like that. Um, Even the Spaniards are writing back to Spain. They're puffing themselves up to make themselves look like heroes, right? When actually they couldn't have conquered, like Cortez couldn't have conquered Tenochtitlan, which is the Aztec or Mexica capital, without actually alliances with other native peoples who were disgruntled by situations there as well. And so, even when they write about themselves as being uh, heroes, that they're erasing native presence. Um, so we want to look at the Central American president here, and then the quote here. In addition to the 12 million deaths in the Caribbean, conquest, which is really and truly nothing other than a series of violent incursions into the territory by these cruel tyrants, incursions condemned not only in the eyes of God, but also by law and in practice far worse than the assaults mounted on the Turk and his attempts to destroy Christendom. The Europeans have, throughout these 450 leagues, butchered and burned alive or otherwise done to death 4 million souls, young and old alike, women and children, and this figure does not include those killed and still being killed today as a direct result of the tyrannical slavery and oppression and privation of its victims, that are forced to endure on a daily basis. When we see these accounts from an eyewitness person like Bartolome de las Casas, you want to think about like what you'd be doing if you're like trying a case in court. He has no reason. It actually hurts him to inform on the conquistadors this way. So he has nothing to gain. That makes him a credible witness in the eyes of legal cases. And it also allows us to know that like we can't like fall back on sometimes people have tried to justify things like, oh, that's just the way things were back then, and everybody was violent or something, and nobody thought had like ethical problems with this. It's like, no, from the beginning, the Europeans know and have concerns about ways Native peoples are being treated unjustly. Even if like we would still say that like forced conversion to Christianity is also unjust too, right? Like from today's perspective, that's unjust as well. But all we need to do is look at is the Spanish themselves. They know that they're doing something horribly wrong. In Ward Churchill's book, A Little Matter of Genocide, which I think is still one of the best books on the subject, Churchill argues against those who would deny intent to genocide and they minimize it. And you will see some scholars who are like, oh, well, it wasn't really genocide because it wasn't state sponsored or something like that. You can obviously see by the way I'm talking that the way that I feel about such statements. Churchill says that in each case, spiraling death rates resulted technically from, quote, disease, always in combination with deliberately induced malnutrition, sustained exposure to the elements, and other physically debilitating circumstances, separating death by disease from death by starvation, and circumstances is virtually impossible rather than direct killing. And this is what something Churchill, you want to look at Churchill's text in his books about this, because even the three big books that I've been like kind of reacting to, Ned Blackhawk, Kathleen Duval, and Pekka Hamalainen, they all like throw in the disease stuff, but they don't really, go into the fact that actually like germ warfare is being used in Europe before and by um, like Genghis Khan and people like that. It's being used in Asia and Europe well before Europeans have contact with Native Americans. So it's on their map. They know that it's there. I already had these uh, maps on my earlier slides, and just like that before they're coming over in their various waves into the northern continent. We had the Roanoke colony. If I'm going to can zero in on the Wampanoags and the so-called Pilgrims, right, who come over, right? So the first colony is definitely Jamestown. That's sustained by the English, right? There's the 1585 colony doesn't work, like it dissolves, and then so we get Jamestown in 1607. That's for down in Virginia, but we want to focus on New England for a second. Wampanoags receive their first European contact in 1524 from Europe, and deal with voyagers intermittently. But by 1602, there was yearly contact with Europeans. So disease and all sorts of stuff had already been brought into the area. There's in 1602, Gosnold slash 1603. Martin Pring says that Wampanoags were eager for trade, and when he got tired of them, so this is an English, um, not so much colonist, but just a trader. When he got tired of them, he let it loose his giant mastiffs on them to run off the natives. So this is like, the conditions that natives are already being faced with. Verrazano, who's an explorer, notes fields extending 25 to 30 leagues. They're open and free of any obstacles or trees, so fertile that any kind of seed would produce excellent crops. The statement reveals the horticultural practices and the population of tens of thousands of Narragansetts and Wampanoags in the area who would later be at war um, with one another. And there are also fields of maize or corn that he's noticing. Um, uh, could be it could be that enmity arose among natives over themselves having access to English or European traders as well. So there's a political disruptions that happen when the Europeans come in. Verrazano notes that the Indians didn't know what their weapons were, but merely seemed curious about their craftsmanship. So again, these repeats of things that we saw with Columbus, right? Wampanoags are no longer friendly to the English by 1611. And it's like, well, yeah, like who's going to be friendly if you're like sticking dogs on people after when you're done trading? Squanto or Tisquantum, who's a Patuxet Wampanoag, captured by Thomas Hunt in 1614, among scores of other Wampanoags. like end up over he ends up in Spain and then makes his way to England, learns some English, and then comes back, right? So Indian enslavement by Europeans had been going on for more than a century, despite a 1542 Spanish law against slavery. So all of this destroys trust with Wampanoags before the English even really get there for permanent settlement. First Spain, then England. So lives uh for this is for Squanto. He lives very close to Pocahontas in England. Or her real name is Matawaka. Pocahontas is like a diminutive name. Her English name is Lady Rebecca at the time. So she's already in England. Squanto's there. Probably they're down the street from each other. They've probably met, but we don't have an actual record of them actually meeting, but I mean, like, yeah, two native peoples from different areas, right? Because Matawaka slash Pocahontas is from down in Virginia. Um, so Squanto returns in 1619, and then he's there and meets the so-called Pilgrims when they get there as well. There's a plague in the land from 1616 to 1619 that kills most of the people even before the pilgrims get there. And so the English interpret that as God's will, like vacating the land from them. And then in the Charter for New England and in the pre-contact chapters of Plymouth Plantation, which are in the modules for you to read, it's a primary source, we see that already, even before the Euro Christians have contact with natives, they're already making up these stories about like the land, God making the land for them, sort of stuff. I'm not going to read out all of this sort of stuff. Alongside this, then they start making up this other narrative that says, oh, the natives, they're all savages who want to kill us and and they're killing each other. Because the more that they say that the natives are warlike, the more it creates just war principles, right? So, like just like with the conquistadors, what happens is, or like the European colonists will go in, they'll have trade, but then they'll do something really like unjust towards native people or oppressive to make the indigenous people like fight back. And then they say like, so you look, all of the native peoples, they're warlike and they want to kill all of us. So like we've got to kill all of them or enslave all of them, right? So that's what just war policy does. Francis Jennings also notes that in English that the term savage shows up like in sauvage in French, for example, just kind of means wild and it doesn't always have the negative connotation. But in English usage of the term savage at this time, it becomes super, super negative. And you know this if you're a native English speaker that to call someone savage is like a particularly like a bloodthirsty kind of savage type of thing. Jennings also notes in his book about the 1585 failed Virginia colony, but when we look at their intent, the colonists say that the intents of the voyage are to plant the Christian religion, to traffic, to trade, right? And then, or to conquer, or to do all three of these things. This is what the colonists themselves say they're intending to do. So the intent to vilify the savage was directly part of a propaganda strategy to portray them as incapable of cultivating land while moving into villages and depriving them of their sources. A really good book on this is This Land is Their Land by David Silverman. So just pointing out uh, that uh, that's a good source for you all. He notes John Smith, who doesn't isn't the person who marries Matawaka or Pocahontas. That's a myth. She marries John Rolfe, and actually the King of England gets mad at him because he's not a noble person, and the King of England sees Matawaka as royalty, and he's like, "What is this lower class person doing?" Um, Marrying royalty, like trying to like rise above their station. Um, uh, John Smith noticed that in Virginia, on the East Coast in general, the coast was so well planted with gardens and cornfields and so well inhabited with a goodly, strong, and well proportioned people that he judged it an excellent place for health and fertility Um, and all of the four parts of the world that I have yet seen not inhabited by Europeans. He extolled, could I have the means to transport a colony, I would rather live here than anywhere else in the world. So obviously we have eyewitness accounts to lots and lots of cultivation of the land and farming, and it's a good way, a good life, right? That the native peoples have before a lot of Europeans are coming. And then we have during this period, like this is kind of like was driving the pilgrims to come here. There had been a 12-year truce because there were these religious wars all over Europe from 1517 from the Reformation on. But there had been a 12-year truce in between Netherlands Protestants and Catholic Spain. So Catholic Spain was set to come to rule in Netherlands at the time. And so the Protestants feel like their time is coming up, and so they got to get out of there. Pilgrims make a deal with Thomas Weston of the Virginia Company to transport them to Virginia under the Virginia title in exchange, the exchange was that they would produce goods in the new Virginia colony for the company, but they don't make it there. They end up like up north in Cape Cod, as it's called today. And then they meet with Usemakin, who arrives immediately. And this is you can read about this in the of Plymouth Plantation. Usemakin arrives with 60 troops within an hour of Squanto's first conversation with the English. So there's a lot of organization going on for Native people. And this is a map of Wampanoag country in the 1600s, and we get a lot of different bands, Patuxet, for example, and here Mashpee as well, and all in what's now Massachusetts. Um, when we look at the King James Charter of New England, again, we see that he's pulling from Doctrine of Discovery in order to create the titles or the claims to sovereignty, that the land has no other subjects or Christian prince, and because of that, it can be claimed for Christianity, right? So even though it's a Protestant effort, or England is a Protestant country, they're pulling from the Doctrine of Discovery legal apparatus to justify their own invasion. New England Charter has a lot of this. I'm not going to read it all out for you. You can pause and read through it. If you get really interested, you can read the whole thing. I have a chapter in a book where I've gone through and just like highlighted all of these things where we see the repeated rationales from the doctrine of discovery, right? Rendering reverend thanks to his divine majesty for his gracious favor in laying open and revealing the same unto us before any other Christian prince or state, by which means without offense, and we trust to his glory, we may the boldness with boldness go on to settling and so hopeful a work, and which tendeth to the reducing and conversion of such savages as remain wandering in desolation and distress. So they're justifying their presence by the conversion of the native peoples here. Um, Again, there's that um, the, early on, all of the contact sources say that the Indians have no religion, right? And so that's important too. It's only later. Also, we notice from accounts like Linford Fisher's book here stuff is that like there weren't that many native converts to Christianity too. And then we get the Boston colony showing up with the Puritans, and then they make laws that are forcing native people to go to church. And if people don't go to church, then that justifies them being enslaved or being imprisoned, right? So other sources here, including my friend Tink Tinker, whose book Missionary Conquest is still, I think, one of the best books about early Christianization efforts in the area, not just in New England, not just in Massachusetts, but in Maryland with Roger Williams and other folks as well. More from the New England Charter here. This is just stuff that repeats concepts from the papal bulls, or concepts that are reflective of that Euro-Christian worldview. You can pause again. I'm just giving you some sources here to look through. So the Puritans arrive in the late 1620s, just north of the Plymouth colony. And they are a kind of different breed of Puritan of I mean they call themselves Puritans for their more extreme Protestant branch, but they're also more in line with movements that are happening in England. So what you got to understand is that what's brewing at this same time in English history is what's going to become the English Civil War, where they oust um Charles and eventually like King Charles I, and they eventually decapitate him and the Puritans run Parliament in England for a while. And then there's the restoration of the monarchy at the end of the 1650s, and Charles II comes into power. And that will, when he comes back into power, that's going to change all of these legal structures over in Virginia, where we get those Virginia laws that I've been talking about, that have a relationship to race as well. Um, uh, in the meantime, like things are looking dire in England, and at first the Puritan colony doesn't do well, but by the mid 1630s, there's a lot more growth in the Puritan colony, and then they have these wars with the native people, and they're winning, and that causes people over in England who are Puritans to kind of jump more on the bandwagon. There is a massacre near Mystic River where in May of 1637 that slays more than 400 peacocks. The English, along with Mohegan and Narragansett allies, kill all of them, mostly women and children. Only surviving peacocks were men away on a hunting trip. So the English declared that their success to be a sign of God's providence, and they declare a Thanksgiving after they return home. There were lots of things called Thanksgivings at the time. That's what but what's interesting here is that the Thanksgiving is declared because they have won this very bloody massacre of people. 1638, we get a Treaty of Hartford declaring wrongly that the peacocks are extinct. Some of them were away, and we see them returning later on, some famous ones showing up in the 1800s. So there are other peacocks that are visiting or take refuge within other native groups. Roger Williams, another missionary colonizer, said like reports that he secured the sachems, which is just a term for like chief for the, but it's more local to the area. So leaders, local leaders, that he'd secured sachems' consent to build at Providence, Rhode Island, right? Not by monies or by payment. Monies could not do it, he says. So there to be some sort of trade thing. But rather, he says what was paid was only a gratuity, though I chose for better assurance to call it a sale. So he's actually making these kind of small pittance trades with the natives peoples, and then he's saying in his mind that giving him they're trading the land for that. But obviously that like the native people are not in any way trading the land for like the things that Williams says. So there's some trickery going on there. When the English gave or traded arms with Indians, they were fined under Plymouth law. So there was an attempt to make sure that the native folks don't have access to guns and things like that. By 1663, there's a Wampanoag Bible, so there's a translation into a native language. Caleb Chishashtamuk, who's a son of a sachem Nobnocket, is the first native graduate of Harvard in 1665. So Harvard is set up like and Dartmouth and what are the private Ivy League colleges were originally set up within the idea that they were going to be schools that educated and converted natives. In 1664, about one third of Christian Wampanoags could read and write their own language, in their own language. They converted some converting natives. Christian missionaries would convert natives to make so-called praying towns as a way to then get them to align with Christians, and then try to get the Christianized Indians to then get land use from sachems. So sachems grow wise to this, and not a single one of the sachems in New England allows for a mission to be set up, right? And then Usamakant warned the English not to evangelize his people. So we see this clear kind of rebuffing of Christianity going on. And Christianity and conversion is being used as a way to grab land. Then we get that Pequot War. There's a smallpox plague that devastates natives in the early 1630s as the English population surges. Many come from England as their civil war brews. The direct quote here, the direct cause of war was Massachusetts' insistence that the Pequots extradite tribal members accused of murdering a troublemaking English merchant, John Stone, and his crew. Pequot sachems offered compensation for the dead in the form of gifts and lands and furs, but they would not meet the English demand and probably would not could not without risking their own lives. So that's a quote from Silverman. So what had happened was this guy, John Stone, everybody thought he was a jerk to begin with, right? He was causing trouble throughout the area, and he eventually like overstepped enough that he gets himself killed. And so this becomes like a legal conflict. And we see repetitions of this all the way up to the recent Supreme Court case called McGirt, which is a famous decision from a few years ago, right? Where it's like, who gets to be the hand of justice in a particular area? And there's no way that the Native people are going to say that, like, we're going to extradite people. It's and let the colonists deal with justice here. But the colonists are starting to say, like, no, because he's a Christian, we get to deal with him. And then they're going to say later on, because he's white, that they're going to like that racial language is going to replace stuff. So in response here, the English send a punitive expedition against Pequots and Manassas Indians in 1636. The Pequots respond by killing 9 residents of Wethersfield, Connecticut in April of 1637 and the capture of 2 girls. And then we get this is stuff that leads up to that Mystic Falls massacre. Um, Really useful books for this area. I've already mentioned Tinker's book, Missionary Conquest. Margaret Ellen Newell, and if you're listening to modules, you'll get this week, you will hear her talking. And The Tainted Gift on the Disease and Gift Economies by Barbara Alice Mann are good scholarly resources here. Too much information on this slide for me to go through, but what I'm quoting here is one of the earliest legal bodies in Massachusetts. And what we see is like after the Pequot War is where we start seeing more and more enslavement of Native peoples, and we get some of the first laws that are starting to racialize peoples. So law like it repeats earlier laws from 1215 Fourth Lateran Council over in Europe that asked, and during that particular moment, Christians made Jewish people and Muslims wear clothing or something that signified them being a different religion from the Christians, so, and created laws against the intermarrying between Christians. So we see that, and you can think about the Nazis making people wear yellow stars, for example. That comes from that 1215 Fourth Lateran Council's attempt of Christians like forcing non-Christians to identify themselves in a certain way. So like we look at Article 89, if any people of other nations professing the Christian rule shall flee to us from the tyranny or the oppression of their persecutors, or from famine, wars, and the necessary compulsory cause, they shall be entertained and succored against us, according to that power of prudence God shall give us. There shall never be named bond, slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just war. So there's the just war theory. And then such strangers as willingly belie themselves are sold to us. And these shall have the liberties and Christian usages of the law of God established but in Israel concerning this person's such such persons doeth morally require. This exempts none from servitude who shall be judged by the authority. So that we're starting to see these laws that are distinguishing natives peoples, like granting special rights to people who convert to Christianity, but also saying that maybe it's still not going to like get you out of servitude. And then we see the maintaining of freedom of movement depended on professing Christian faith, right? If natives did that, then they could go about their ways. Um, This is perhaps fittingly followed by two statutes on the treatment of brutes, as they call them. If any man, after legal conviction, shall have or worship another God, but the Lord God, he shall be put to death. So there, it's like right there in the law. If you're not a Christian, you can be put to death. If any man or woman be a witch, also they shall be put to death or consult with a familiar spirit. If any person shall blaspheme the name of God, the Father, Son, or the Holy Ghost, which with direct express or presumptuous or high-handed blasphemy, or shall curse God in a like manner, he shall be put to death. And so what you see is like a lot of times the native people, when Christians would try to Christianize native people, they would be like, this is laughable. Like, this is crap. Like, how can you even believe that? Just like anybody who's trying to convert somebody to their religion today might say certain things. And what we're seeing is in the body of liberties, in the law codes, what we're seeing is the being put into law that people can be killed for rejecting Christianity, right? And then we also see poor laws from England being imported into the Massachusetts Body of Liberties courts. um, so after a number of statutes confirming the freedom of Christian churches and the right of unaffiliated newcomers to join one as so long as it follows Christ, which is the foundation for religious liberty in New England, then becomes the foundation for religious liberty in the United States. It never extended to Native peoples, right? Not in the colonial period, and certainly not after the United States comes into existence. But we see here all of the people of God within this jurisdiction who are not in a church way and be orthodox in judgment and not scandalous in life shall have the full liberty to gather themselves in a church estate, provided that they do it in a Christian way with due observation of the rules of Christ revealed in his word. There is no such thing as the native people having like a different religion from Christianity and that being tolerated, right? Religious tolerance never, in the colonizer's mind, extends to native practices. They say in Statute 97, we likewise give full power and liberty to any person that shall at any time be denied or deprived any of them to commence and persecute their suit, complaint, or action against any man who shall do in any court that hath proper cognizance and judicature of thereof. So in some ways, it's like in order to get like what I'm getting at with the ambiguous statement here is that even to be represented or to fight a case in court, you have to become a Christian to do that too, right? To have representation. So one did not need to be a state or church official to be protected. However, one needed to be a Christian in order to be granted liberty. Liberty is a particular philosophical concept that's tied to a special status granted to the white colonizer or the Euro-Christian. These moral attitudes would then reappear in the 19th century philosophical articulations such as John Stuart Mills's liberalism and utilitarianism. So just wanted to touch in there in this like briefer lecture on the legal apparatuses that are being framed importing poor laws and justifying either the outright death of Native peoples who refuse to convert or using their refusal to convert as a way to justify their imprisonment or their enslavement, their being put into servitude, they're being shipped away from the colonies. And it comes down to like even if somebody heckles like a pastor in church, like that becomes justification for imprisoning native peoples as well during the period. So really, really harsh stuff around religion. And again, it's like that there's not race discussion so much happening yet. Although we start getting the first laws around slavery showing up as slavery of native peoples, not slavery of African peoples. That comes later, and we see a lot more of that in Virginia laws in the 1660s. And then by the end of the 1600s, we see a lot more of that racialized distinction between white people and Africans, for example, instead of Christian, non-Christian. And that happens because of this thing called Bacon's Rebellion, which I will talk about in another lecture. Thanks for listening to this one.